What up dudes, today I'm going to be talking about the Panasonic GH5 and the 1DX Mark II and why you'd buy one over the other. They've both got advantages and they've both got their disadvantages. So let's get straight into it. So the first thing with these cameras is this one only costs just over $2,000 for the body, and the Canon 1DX Mark II in Australia costs just over $6,000. So the comparison is a little bit ridiculous when you're talking about price, but this beats this camera in a lot of ways and this beats this camera in a lot of ways. So I thought I'd make a video. I've seen a lot of people asking about the comparisons of these cameras, so I thought I'd make one. So don't jump in the comments and be like, but this costs much more less than this. I do know that. So my favorite advantage that the GH5 has is this little guy, this flip out screen. I mean, you can record pointing down at something, you can record up high, and you can just always see what you're recording. You can also flip it around and have it facing yourself so you can judge your framing and your exposure. That is a huge advantage over the 1DX Mark II. Unfortunately, the screen on this just isn't that great. Like, if this could flip out, this would easily be my favorite camera by far. It looks like there was enough room to be able to do it. That's what annoys me so much, is there's so many amazing Canon full frame cameras, but they don't have that flip out screen. So the next thing I want to talk about is slow motion. The GH5 can shoot at 180 frames a second in 1080p, and the 1DX Mark II can only shoot in 120 frames a second in 1080p. But for some reason, I felt like the 120 frames a second footage looked a lot better in the GH5 than the 180 frames a second. So I was just using 120 frames on this anyway. These are both amazing cameras for slow motion, but I would have to give the advantage to the GH5, and that's where I'm going to get into my next thing. This only has lens stabilization, so the image stabilization only works in the lens. There's no in-body stabilization. The advantage with this guy here is that not only does it have lens stabilization, but it also has stabilization inside the camera. So when you're taking those slow-mo shots, it almost looks like it's on a gimbal. It's absolutely incredible. And not only that, you can also have digital stabilization, which is you can pretty much do that in post on the 1DX Mark II anyway. It just crops in a little bit and just balances out that image a little bit more. The lens and body stabilization, I actually couldn't believe it. I was walking around and it was like it was on a gimbal. It's absolutely amazing. So this beats this when it comes to image stabilization in video. Now, battery life, surprisingly, this GH5 lasts a long time on one battery. Not compared to the 1DX Mark II. I found that this just shoots and shoots and shoots for so long, it just doesn't seem to run out. I've only bought 2 batteries for this camera, and I haven't managed to chew through 2 in a whole day of shooting. I've got 3 batteries for this camera, and I just seem to chew through them. But compared to most cameras, this lasts a really, really long time, especially for a mirrorless camera. So this wins when it comes to batteries. I also absolutely love the charger that this comes with. It tells you how charged the batteries are when you put them in. But unsurprisingly, these things are absolutely huge. I mean, look at that for a battery. I mean, let's compare these guys. You can see the difference right there. These are just like tanks. When I'm talking about slow motion, this actually does have a huge advantage. You can actually use autofocus while you're shooting in 120 frames a second. This, you cannot use autofocus. It just switches straight over to manual. It's a bit frustrating, but this has focus peaking. So what focus peaking is you can just see like an outline of what is actually in focus, which helps a lot. This does not have focus peaking in any frame rate or anything like that, but the dual pixel autofocus on this camera is just so good that I can pretty much trust it all the time, like every time. I mean, there's a few shots where it'll skip a beat, but the autofocus on this is just incredible. The autofocus on this is garbage. I just never used it. So technically I did use the autofocus. I didn't use continuous autofocus. The autofocus on this camera is surprisingly good, but the continuous autofocus is just trash. Like, if you expect this to follow your face and move the camera back and forward, you're going to have absolutely no hope. When the 1DX Mark II, this is just an absolute beast. It just nails it almost every time. If this camera seriously had decent autofocus, I would never have bought this. This is like the main reason why I have this camera, is the dual pixel autofocus. You can just put this on a gimbal and it'll follow whatever you have in front of you. This, on the other hand, I would only ever shoot in autofocus and not continuous autofocus. They've been trying to do firmware updates over and over again, and they just haven't seemed to fix it. So next up is weight. I'm gonna weigh the 1DX Mark II and then I'll weigh the GH5. So the 1DX Mark II weighs 2.2 kilos, just under 2.2 kilos. And the GH5 weighs just over a kilo. So this literally weighs double what the GH5 weighs. So I've actually gotten used to the weight of the 1DX Mark II. This is absolutely, this feels like a kid's camera after using this for so long, which is an advantage to a lot of people. I mean, if you want to be really inconspicuous and walk around with this, it is a lot easier than walking around with this big guy. So the thing I actually do like about the 1DX Mark II though is I've been recording in lots of places and you'll have people come up to you and instantly ask what you do for a living or ask about your camera. This is just an absolute huge conversation starter, and I've actually probably got about 5 subscribers just from people coming up and talking to me, and I've just given them my YouTube channel. I always have stickers in my wallet. This is just an absolute huge conversation starter, which is another reason why I like this camera. And I kind of believe it's worth carrying this huge brick around. Just over 2 kilos doesn't sound like much, but when you're carrying this out like that, especially on a gorilla pod for like a long period of time, this thing tends to weigh a ton. Like, if I go out for a whole day and shoot, I'll come home with a sore back. It ends up weighing a lot more than it sounds like, believe me. Now, another huge reason why people buy Canon cameras is for the color science. Now, what that is just the colors that you get out of these cameras. They're absolutely exceptional. I absolutely love that you can get just that creamy Canon color. It's so hard to explain. You just need to go watch some Canon 1DX Mark II videos. I'll link one down below. The color is just amazing in these cameras. Then compared to this, not so much. But this does have a huge advantage over the Canon 1DX Mark II, in that you can get flat profiles. You can get like C-Log and V-Log or D-Log. You know what I mean. So in other words, you can color grade your footage to make it look how you want to look a lot better than you can with this. I mean, you'll get this flat washed out image and you can just color grade it and add saturation, add all those things and just get your look rather than having it already baked into whatever you are making. I tend to do less color grading on this and a lot more on this, but it has its own advantages and it's kind of cool to create your own look with the GH5. Now, another thing is ease of use. I find the Canon 1DX Mark II a lot easier to use. The menus are easy to understand. The GH5 is quite confusing, but I kind of like that because there's a lot of things in here that you can change that you can't really change in here. It is confusing, but I found there's an info button you can push and it literally tells you what each thing does. So they're pretty similar. They both have their advantages. I find this easier to use, but I love that there's a lot more things you can change, especially when you know what you're doing and you're scrolling through that menu. So if you are a professional videographer, I would probably suggest buying one of these and trying it out before going this. This is more a photography and video camera rather than just, you know, it's more of a hybrid. So that's why I like this camera. I love photography and I love video at the same time. When this is pretty much built for video, I would not really use this as a photography camera. So one thing I absolutely hate about the 1DX Mark II is that it has no Wi-Fi connectivity. You can't connect this to your phone without plugging in an adapter. You actually need to spend hundreds of dollars for this adapter too. It's not cheap, just so you can get Wi-Fi on this guy. When this, it works straight away, and the Panasonic app is absolutely amazing. The Canon app is amazing as well, but you need that adapter. It's a $6,000 camera with no Wi-Fi. It's such a disappointing flaw of this camera right here. Now, another thing that I kind of dislike a lot about the Canon 1DX Mark II is you can't just take time lapses in camera and turn them into a video. You can do that with the GH5, and you can also do it and change them into photos and do it in post. This, you'll need an intervalometer to take those time lapses, which is really frustrating, and then you have to match them all together in post. I love being able to just shoot time lapses on this and then just instantly turn them into a video straight away. It's another thing that really frustrates me, that I've spent $6,000 on a camera and it doesn't have that. So now I'm going to be talking about 4K crop. In the 1DX Mark II, when you shoot in 1080p, it'll use the whole sensor to take the whole image. And then when you use 4K, it'll actually crop in on the sensor to capture that 4K. I've heard that's due to stop overheating and lots of other things. I'm not exactly sure why they do that, and it's kind of frustrating. It is a huge crop. I'll play some footage in the corner of the difference between the 1080p crop and the 4K crop. It's kind of confusing because the Panasonic is a crop sensor technically. It is a micro 4/3 sensor, which is a lot smaller than the 1DX Mark II, but there's no crop on that sensor. If you shoot in 1080p, it remains the same size as when you shoot in 4K, which is another thing that I absolutely love about this camera. Even when shooting on the 1DX Mark II, and I've got a 16 to 35 millimeter lens, which is really wide for full frame, I'll hold it quite far away, and it still just isn't enough for me to be a huge fan of. I know there's wider lenses, but I choose not to buy lenses without image stabilization, and the 16 to 35 that I have seems to be the widest lens that they have with image stabilization. So next off, I'm going to be talking about sensors in these cameras. The GH5 has a micro 4/3 sensor, when the 1DX Mark II has a 35 millimeter sensor, which is a lot bigger. Now, the reason why you'd want a bigger sensor is because these work a lot better in low light. They can go to higher ISOs without getting that grainy noise look that you always see in smaller sensor cameras. And also you get better bokeh or a shallower depth of field. So on this, if I was filming at a low aperture, the background would be a lot blurrier than if I was to film on the GH5 here. So you get that really cinematic look with that really nice background blur, which is a huge advantage to this guy and another main reason why I got this. So next off, I want to talk about the touch screens. When touching the Panasonic GH5 and focusing and using the menu and all of that, it's absolutely brilliant. It works for everything in the camera. I've found myself using the touch screen a lot more than the buttons, which is kind of unusual for me. When using the 1DX Mark II, the touch screen only works for auto-focusing and focusing on things. When you try use it in the menu, it literally does not work. You can click all day on the menu and nothing happens. It's kind of frustrating that they'd give you a touch screen and it doesn't even work in the menu. It only works for auto-focusing or focusing on things. Now, when talking about image quality and shooting in different bit rates and whatnot, this GH5 is absolutely amazing. You can pretty much pick absolutely any kind of format you want to shoot in. It's pretty much there. I love that you can shoot in different bit rates, because if you have like a really average memory card, you'll be able to just change the bit rate to a lower bit rate, or if you have an amazing, really expensive memory card, you can change it to a higher bit rate, which means a better quality footage. Which brings me to another point, CFast cards. The CFast cards and the 1DX Mark II, they're really, really expensive to buy. I think this was like $400 or something ridiculous for 128 gigabytes, when the 128 gigabyte SD card that I have in the GH5 was only like $90 or something. Canon also have this horrible format in the 1DX Mark II. It's called Motion JPEG, which leaves your files a ridiculous size. They're just absolutely massive. It's pretty much like taking a photo for every single frame of video that this captures. When the files on this are just absolutely small and easy to work with, you load them straight into Premiere Pro and they just work. I've had to start converting the files on this into different formats just because they just do not seem to like Premiere Pro. I don't know if anyone else has had this problem, but the formats are absolutely frustrating to use. I would not bother buying one of these unless you plan on having a lot of storage or deleting your footage after every video you make. Now I'm just going to straight up compare the 4K footage. To me, I believe the GH5's 4K looks better than the 1DX Mark II's. It looks sharper. It's kind of like a personal preference. You could argue all you want that it's better on the 1DX Mark II or it's better on this. It's really debatable, but I reckon the 4K looks sharper in this. I think that's due to them taking out the anti-aliasing filter. What that does is stop moire, which is like, have you ever seen people wear those like lined shirts or shirts with really close together stripes, and it kind of does that really weird fuzzy weird thing? Well, they don't have that in this camera anymore. When the Canon 1DX Mark II does. Now that could be seen as an advantage, but it could also be seen as a disadvantage. It just really depends on what you're going for, but I seriously think that the 4K in this just looks a lot sharper than what it does on the Canon 1DX Mark II. Now, when comparing these both, you have to remember that this is a video camera that can take photos, and this is a photography camera that can take video. That's the way I look at both of these. But the Canon does both really well. When the GH5 just does video really well. I would not really use this for a photography camera. A lot of people actually do, but it's not really my cup of tea. This is an absolute beast when it comes to photography. It's just absolutely exceptional, the things that you can do with this camera. So another thing I want to talk about is lenses. The GH5 just doesn't have a good enough selection of lenses, especially when it comes to wide angle. Like I bought a 7 to 14 millimeter, I think it is, Panasonic lens, and I put it on this and it has no inbuilt image stabilization in the actual lens. I tried to turn the in-body image stabilization on the camera and it was still really shaky and like frustrating to use. The Canon 1DX Mark II, there's so many amazing full frame lenses. Like I've got a 16 to 35 with image stabilization. I've got a 24 to 70 with image stabilization and a 70 to 200 with image stabilization. There's so much more selection than what the GH5 has, and the glass seems to just be amazing on all these cameras. I do love the 12 to 35 millimeter that I have for this. It's an amazing lens. I love the dual image stabilization, but overall, I just love Canon glass. It's a huge reason why I bought this camera. So that was just my rant on these two cameras. I tried to be as unbiased as possible. I am actually selling the GH5 right now. I'm going to keep the 1DX Mark II. I know as soon as this camera goes, I will be upset to see it leave. This is absolutely amazing, but right now this is the camera for me. I'm also buying a 60 Mark II in replace of this to use as my second camera. It was kind of frustrating using these both together because it was annoying color grading and trying to match the footage. So I am actually going to buy a 60 Mark II just so I can do that and match the footage better with the Canon 1DX. I hope you like this video. Make sure you click that like button if you learned anything, and make sure you click subscribe and click the bell button next to the subscribe button if you want to be notified anytime I make a video. And I'm out.